Free my daddy, and I'll make you walk again." The courtroom exploded into laughter. An 8-year-old girl had just told a judge, a man who hadn't walked in 11 years, that she would make him walk again if he freed her father. Before you think this is just another sad story, stay with me until the end, because what happened in that courtroom over the next 20 minutes silenced a room full of adults who thought they'd heard everything. Her name was Nora Bennett, and 2 months before that afternoon in court, her whole world had been ordinary in the best way. She lived with her father, Daniel Bennett, in a small rented house at the edge of Millhaven, a quiet town where everybody waved at everybody, and the diner on Main Street still gave free pie to kids on their birthdays. Daniel was 34 years old, a mechanic by trade, but an inventor by nature. He'd lost Nora's mother to illness when Nora was only 4, and from that day forward, it had been the two of them against the world. Daniel working double shifts at the auto shop by day, and tinkering in the garage by night, building strange little contraptions he called helpers, braces, grips, and gadgets he gave away for free to elderly neighbors and disabled veterans who couldn't afford proper equipment. Nora adored her father with the kind of fierce, uncomplicated love only a child can give. She spent her afternoons in that garage, handing him wrenches, asking 1,000 questions, and believing with total certainty that her daddy could fix anything. Cars, toasters, broken hearts, even people. He never claimed to be a miracle worker. He simply had a gift for understanding how bodies moved, how joints and muscles compensated for injury, and how the right piece of engineering could give someone back a fraction of the mobility they'd lost. It wasn't magic. It was patience, obsession, and love poured into steel and rubber and hinges. Everything changed on a Tuesday evening in early spring. Daniel had gone to deliver one of his custom leg braces to an elderly client on the other side of town, the same as he'd done dozens of times before. On his way home, passing through a stretch of road near the old lumber yard, he stopped when he saw a car pulled over with its hood smoking. He always stopped. That was who he was. What he didn't was that the car belonged to a man wanted for a string of break-ins across 3 counties. A man who fled the moment police arrived minutes later, leaving behind a bag of stolen tools in the trunk of a car registered, through a chain of paperwork errors and a stolen license plate, to Daniel Bennett. Daniel tried to explain. He told the officers he'd only stopped to help a stranger, but the tools matched a burglary report from the week before, and Daniel's fingerprints, transferred innocently from simply touching the man's car door to check the engine, were found on the trunk. Circumstantial evidence stacked against him like dominoes, each one falling into the next, and within days, Daniel Bennett, a man who had never so much as gotten a parking ticket, sat in a jail cell, awaiting trial for burglary charges he had absolutely nothing to do with. Nora was sent to stay with her Aunt Carol, a kind but overwhelmed woman, raising 2 kids of her own. Every night, Nora sat by the window with her father's old sketchbook of invention designs pressed against her chest, refusing to believe that her daddy, the man who fixed broken things for free, who never once raised his voice, who tucked her in every single night with the same silly bedtime rhyme, could possibly be guilty of anything. The trial date arrived faster than anyone expected. Public defenders in Millhaven were overworked and underpaid, and Daniel's court-appointed lawyer, a tired man named Mr. Higgins, barely had time to review the case before stepping into the courtroom. The prosecution painted a tidy, convenient story: a mechanic with easy access to tools, fingerprints at the scene, a suspicious vehicle connection. It didn't matter that Daniel had no criminal record, no motive, and a dozen neighbors willing to vouch for his character. The story was simple, and simple stories win in courtrooms that move too fast. On the 3rd day of the trial, something happened that nobody, including Nora herself, had planned. She had been sitting in the gallery beside her aunt, watching her father grow smaller and smaller in his seat as the prosecutor spoke, when something in her chest simply broke open. Before Aunt Carol could stop her, Nora slipped out of her seat, walked straight down the center aisle of the courtroom, past stunned bailiffs, too surprised to intercept a child, and stood at the small witness podium in front of the judge's bench. The judge presiding over the case was the Honorable Walter Pierce, a man who had sat on that bench for over 20 years, known throughout the county for his sharp mind and his even sharper silences. 11 years earlier, a car accident on an icy highway had taken the use of his legs, confining him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He had never once let it soften his reputation. If anything, the accident had hardened him. He ran his courtroom with unforgiving precision, and he did not tolerate interruptions, especially not from children. "Young lady," Judge Pierce said, his voice stern but not unkind. "This is not the place for—" "Please," Nora interrupted, her small hands gripping the edge of the podium so tightly, her knuckles turned pale. "My daddy didn't do this. He stops to help people. That's all he does. He never hurts anybody." A ripple of uncomfortable sympathy moved through the gallery. Judge Pierce's expression softened only slightly. "I understand you love your father," he said, "but the law requires evidence, not feelings." And that was when Nora said the words that would end up on the front page of the Millhaven Gazette by the end of the week. "Then I have something better than feelings," she said, lifting her chin. "Free my daddy, and I'll make you walk again." The courtroom erupted into laughter. Lawyers exchanged smirks. A court reporter had to cover her mouth to keep from openly chuckling. Someone in the back row said, loud enough to be heard, "Bless her heart," in that particular tone people use when they think a child has said something adorably absurd. Aunt Carol buried her face in her hands, mortified and heartbroken at once. But Judge Pierce did not laugh. He raised one hand, and the laughter in the room died almost instantly, the way it always did when he demanded silence. He studied the small girl in front of him for a long moment, his sharp gray eyes narrowing not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity. "That is quite a promise," he said slowly. "Explain yourself." Nora reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper, a hand-drawn sketch, done in her father's careful engineering hand, of a mechanical leg brace with hinges at the knee and ankle, adjustable tension springs, and small annotations in the margins. "My daddy builds these," she said, "for people who can't walk right. He builds them in our garage, for free, because he says everybody deserves to move the way they want to move. He built one for Mr. Alvarez down the street, who lost his leg in the war. He built one for old Miss Whitfield, who broke her hip. He's not a thief. He's the person thieves should be scared of, because he fixes everything they break." Judge Pierce stared at the sketch for a long time. Something in his stillness shifted. The courtroom sensed it before anyone understood why. 11 years of specialists, therapists, and machines had told him, in various careful clinical language, that there was little left to try. But something about the specific detail in that child's drawing, the precision of the tension springs, the notation about distributing pressure away from a damaged joint, caught his attention in a way glossy medical brochures never had. "Bailiff," Judge Pierce said quietly, "bring me the defendant's file. All of it. Every piece of evidence, not the summary." For the next hour, in a move almost unheard of in that courtroom, Judge Pierce personally combed through the case files, while the room sat in stunned silence. He noticed what the overworked defense attorney had missed: a timestamp discrepancy between the burglary report and the moment Daniel's car was seen on a gas station security camera nowhere near the crime scene. He noticed those fingerprints on the trunk were consistent with someone checking an engine, not loading stolen goods. He ordered the case temporarily adjourned and demanded the original arresting officers return the next morning with full incident logs, not summaries. What the officers brought back the next day would unravel the entire case. The following morning, under Judge Pierce's direct and unrelenting questioning, one of the arresting officers admitted, hesitantly, that the vehicle's license plate had actually been flagged as stolen 3 days prior to the incident, meaning the car pulled over. That night was almost certainly not the same car connected to the burglary ring at all, but one of several similarly registered vehicles caught in a clerical mix-up during a records migration. Combined with the gas station footage, placing Daniel miles away at the reported time of a related break-in. The prosecution's case didn't just weaken, it collapsed entirely. 2 days later, Daniel Bennett walked out of that courthouse a free man, blinking in the sunlight like someone waking from a long, terrible dream. Nora ran across the courthouse steps and threw herself into his arms, so hard he nearly stumbled backward, both of them laughing and crying at the same time, while Aunt Carol wiped her eyes nearby. But the story doesn't end there. Word of the courtroom promise spread through Millhaven fast, and eventually reached Judge Pierce's own chambers, in a way he couldn't ignore. Reporters wanted to know if the girl's father would really try to build him something. Judge Pierce, against every instinct of formality, made an unusual request. He asked to meet Daniel Bennett privately. What started as a cautious, almost skeptical conversation between a judge and the man he'd them just helped exonerate turned into something neither of them expected. Daniel studied Judge Pierce's specific injury, his remaining muscle function, the exact nature of his spinal damage, and spent the next 4 months, nights and weekends, unpaid, driven purely by gratitude and purpose, designing a custom-calibrated mobility brace unlike anything he'd built before. It wouldn't restore what the accident had taken completely. Nobody promised a miracle. But paired with intensive physical therapy Judge Pierce had abandoned years earlier out of quiet despair, the brace gave him something he hadn't had in over a decade: partial weight-bearing movement, enough to stand at his own bench for the first time in 11 years, enough to take 4 unsteady but very real steps across his own courtroom floor on the day he returned from medical leave. The room that had once laughed at a little girl's promise stood in complete silence as Judge Pierce gripped the podium and walked, step by careful step, toward his own bench. Nora stood at the back of the gallery, tears streaming down her face, her father's hand resting proudly on her shoulder. The lesson in this story is a simple one, but it's easy to forget. In a world that so often mistakes a child's certainty for foolishness, sometimes the people we're quickest to dismiss are the ones paying the closest attention to what actually matters. Nora Bennett didn't have evidence. She didn't have legal training. What she had was absolute faith in her father's character, and the courage to say so out loud in a room full of adults who thought they knew better. That courage didn't just save her father's freedom. It changed a man's life who had quietly given up hope of ever standing on his own 2 feet again. If this story reminded you that love and persistence can move mountains, or in this case, help someone walk again, let us know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things out of love, subscribe and stay close, because the next story we're bringing you might just be the one that stays with you the longest.